So I'm Janet Peace. I'm the Vice President for Markets and Business Strategy at C2ES, and we're very happy to be releasing this report today. We're very happy to have you all here with us, and very happy to have this panel, this expert panel, to talk about some of their work in building resilience to climate change. The report that we released this morning, I think it looked at some of the important risks that businesses are facing from extreme weather, from changing climate. And we heard about many of these challenges in the first discussion. Our second panel is going to explore more about what companies are doing to get a better grasp of the risks, and what kind of information, what kind of tools are needed to really help them advance their efforts. I'm very pleased to introduce our panel. Your detailed bios are actually in your packets, but to my left we have Jeff Hopkins, Policy Advisor, Economics and Environment with Rio Tinto. Then we have Jeff Williams, Director of Climate Consulting for Entergy. Then Jay Bruns, Vice President for Public Policy, the Hartford. And then Sara Kendall, Vice President Corporate Affairs and Sustainability with the Weyerhaeuser Company. Again, you'll find their bios in your packet. I think you'll agree with me that we have a very, I would call it a very expert lineup to talk to you about what companies are doing in this space. So let me just get started and turn it right over to Jeff to give a few remarks and some perspectives from him and the Rio Tinto company about this issue of building resilience.
Thank you, Janet. Pleased to be here with folks today, and also pleased to be included in the C2ES report. Rio Tinto is an international mining company and was profiled in a climate adaptation or resiliency report that came out several years ago. So it was good to be able to report again on what we're doing and what we've achieved. And I'll give a couple of examples that I think represent different aspects of climate resiliency. The first one is going to be an example in the Northwest Territories of Canada. It's mostly a story about energy, but it's also a story about transportation networks. The second one that I'll talk about is about weather extremes. That setting is in Australia, and I'll give some perspective from a 2011 event that was profiled in the report that talks about coastal vulnerability to cyclones. So a couple of different stories. And the first slide that I have here is just on the left you have a slide that we included in our 2012 report of results. And it's essentially showing a cash cost impact from different sorts of risks that we face, that we know we face, and we're always going to face. And I thought the categories were interesting. Now this shows a cost decrease according to weather. That was for 2012. It's because our costs that were profiled in 2011 thankfully didn't occur in 2012. Not that we necessarily stopped them from occurring, but that there is the weather risk is something that we face, and it's also quite large in many years. So I think putting it in terms of what other risks all businesses face, both input costs and output prices, labor and other things that happen is it's just standard business decision making. But these are large in magnitude. They can be quite large, which means that it's important to get them embedded in the forward-looking planning of businesses, and it's also important to come up with a strategy in order to deal with them and get ahead of them if you can. So again, I'll talk a little bit about process and what we've been engaged in, then our energy story, and then the cyclone story. Next slide. This is a slide about Rio Tinto business process. The dates go back quite a few years, and it's not that we haven't done anything. I guess I wanted to show that we've been working on climate resiliency and adaptation for quite a long time. So in 2002, we used the third assessment report to look at regional impacts and understand what the projections are at a regional level, and to begin to have conversations with our business managers about climate risk. Then we used some more detailed level, and then finally some even more detailed level up to a 20-mile by 20-mile grid in the later work, to begin to forecast climate impacts at the site level. Also, at the corporate initiative was to develop guidance. So that's a process that's in place that we want to put in a framework for adaptive capacity at the corporate level and give guidance to businesses so that they can follow it and plan for it. And as I said, get out ahead of climate events. I have two very different examples of resiliency, and in fact each site would have a slightly different example. So that is one of the challenges, is that you're having to get, and that's why this guidance is useful, because you're not being prescriptive on a site-by-site basis. The risk is going to change, and therefore the kind of bottom-up approach is needed. Because you can't simply say you need to do this or that because of climate, because your climate risk is going to vary depending on what your location is. Next slide. This is the Diavik Diamond Mine, and if anybody's been to the Northwest Territories or Yellowknife, or even watched Ice Road Truckers, you know what the challenge is there. You're essentially supplying remote areas in a 6-week period with an ice road that is constructed collectively over in a sense every year. So you're starting over every year. Now in 2007 we had a very compressed ice road season. This is the site of a diamond mine, and there are some other diamond mines in that area. They're way off grid. The only way that you can operate them is to use diesel generators. That's how all the communities operate in this area. They're beyond the reach of the grid. So you're essentially taking up diesel, taking up supplies during the period of this ice road. So in 2007, the ice road was so soft and so unpassable that the season was compressed even shorter. And it turned out that we had to airlift supplies, which is much more expensive. But we needed to do that in order to keep operations going. The mine had just gotten started. So what we did, in part to address that risk, is look at other ways, other alternatives to power. And we looked at solar, and we looked at them all, but we ended up with wind. And it's the northernmost wind farm. It operates at minus 40 degrees centigrade. What's that in Fahrenheit? It's actually minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit as well. And 9.3 megawatts. Our idea was to displace 10% of the diesel. We've displaced up to 38% of the diesel at certain times of the year, particularly the winter, when it's you're using the most power, but the wind is blowing the most as well. So a very good example. All this was done locally. We had to transport the windmill parts through that same ice road. We didn't have services come in and provide all this. We provided a lot of the expertise ourselves and have tried to extend it to the community. Quickly going on to the next example is in Australia you usually get about 11 cyclones between November and April. The case study on Rio Tinto in the report talks about where we particularly hard hit in 2011. A lot of our resources, iron ore on the west coast and the coal, uranium on the east coast, and copper as well, were heavily impacted, up to 10% losses in production in both the 2010-2011 cyclone year and the 2011-2012. So what we've been engaged in there is there are a lot of different businesses. The bottom left shows where our operations are. We got them to work much more collaboratively than they ever had in the past to jointly fund a tropical cyclone outlook that would be forward-looking, but also weather summaries after it happened in order to learn from, what is the best way, how can we learn from our response, and how can we perfect it over time. So that's the Australian example. It's more about planning, careful planning. So I think the last slide is just summing up this climate action network that we've been operating internally in Australia and sharing information and sharing resiliency and recovery plans. I remember that I've heard National Grid talk before about Sandy, and I've been very impressed with the way that once they knew that it was coming, every single employee had as a facet of their role response to Sandy. And that doesn't work unless you have a plan in place for what those people should be doing. It's otherwise just panic and people are doing different things. That's what I'm talking about in terms of the resiliency. You need to have a plan in place, and you need to. That's just a big part of the resiliency. In some cases, due to regulatory provisions, we've had to do this. But I think that the main driver is the upfront cost cash impacts that I showed before. I mean, we have to financially. So that's Rio Tinto.
Great. Jeff, would you like to share a few of your perspectives at this point?
Sure. I work for Entergy. Entergy is a utility headquartered in New Orleans, provides electricity to 2.8 million customers along the Gulf Coast parts of Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas. Next slide. In 2005 and again in 2008, we were hit with devastating back-to-back hurricanes. Hurricane Katrina, $150 billion loss, largest in history. Our families, our customers were stranded or dispersed to different parts of the country. We're out of work. We're wondering about what tomorrow is going to bring. We have a great deal of poverty in our franchise territory, and unfortunately, the impacts of these extreme storms are disproportionately affect our low-income families, those that can least absorb that. 1,500 people died as a result of Katrina. We all saw the images on CNN, and those people were the ones that didn't have options to leave or didn't have places to go in large part. It's an important aspect of living down here. From a utilities perspective, we lost 1.1 million customers, cost $1.5 billion to restore services. It's a big number. Entergy New Orleans, because it was so devastated and had no revenue coming in, we needed to take that company into bankruptcy in order to bring it back again. But I want to make a point, and it was awakening for us. 1.5 billion is about 1% of 150 billion that our community served. So while in the past we had focused on business continuity, keeping our assets up, protecting those assets, we became more and more aware that the real risk that we needed to manage and do a better job of was preserving the economic integrity of our customer base. When we talk to our customers, we start by sharing values, things that we share together. We talk about that, and it's pretty universal. It's prosperity, being able to make a good living. It's safety for our families, and it's preserving that quality of life that's so important to all of us and keep us living down in this area that's at the point of the spear for hurricanes and storm surge. The other thing is that while there's differences on climate change, their beliefs on that, everybody is concerned about managing today's climate. In the back of our minds, June 1st, we think about what's this year going to bring. And whether we want to admit it or not, many of us are wondering about what the future is going to bring. Can you go to the next slide? One of the things that we realized when we wanted to begin this discussion, thinking about working with our communities, was we didn't have good information. We had, top-down estimates of what climate change could bring, but we really didn't have that good granular information that we could use to have a conversation about what's at risk, what are the scenarios that we should be thinking about, and how can we how can we make investments to reduce some of that loss. We commissioned a study called the Gulf Coast Adaptation Study. It looks at the Gulf Coast from Alabama all the way down to Brownsville, Texas, 70 miles inland. We mapped out assets within this region. We identified $2 trillion of assets that are responsible for about $630 billion of annual GDP. We mapped those out into down to zip code level. We broke them up into 23 different asset classes. We then brought Swiss Re in to do some modeling for some scenarios that we gave them. Probabilistic assessment, modeled 10,000 hurricane years for each of the scenarios. We took a look at three hazards. We took a look at wind, we took a look at flooding, and we took a look at storm surge, and used those models to tell us what average annual loss was. See the next slide? This was the results. Today, the Gulf Coast region is facing $14.2 billion of average annual loss. That grows to nearly $19 billion by 2030, just 20 years out, due to growth in the economy and things that have nothing to do with climate change. Loss of coastal wetlands protection, subsidence, those issues. Our low scenario in 2030 was no climate change. The seas miraculously stop rising and the winds don't become more intense. For our two scenarios of more intense climate change, we identified the problem could be as much as $23 billion per year with climate change. And the conclusion was that this isn't a climate change problem. This is a big problem today that gets worse with climate change going into the future. That allowed us to be able to have a conversation with some of the skeptics and people who would not otherwise want to hear about this. The thing that's important is that loss represents 6 to 8% of capital investment in the region that could be invested in creating wealth, and instead is year after year invested in picking up the pieces. That gets, if you go out to 2050, it gets up to 40 billion, 2100, it's upwards of $100 billion a year, but very uncertain. So we wanted to focus on 2030. Next slide. We took a look at 50 different adaptation investments that we could make. What you see here are 4 different categories: residential, commercial, infrastructure, oil and gas, electric utility, 9 different measures. We identified how much of those we could bring in, what it would cost, and then we estimated the avoided loss if we did that investment. And we ranked that based upon cost-benefit analysis. So you can see that for residential commercial, if you improve the building codes to stand up to greater wind, that has a cost-benefit less than 1. So that's a really good investment. One of the things that was really jumped out at me was the fact that we don't need public funding to do all of these. That 2/3 of the investments that are available to us that are cost-effective can be done because they're economic to do. There's certain things that require public funding: wetlands restoration, there's multiple lines of defense, along with levee system improvements and those types of things. We identified about $7 billion of cost-effective loss prevention. Go to the next slide. So if you go back to 2030, the average case was $21 billion of loss. Through those 9 key actions, we can reduce $7 billion of that loss, get us essentially back down to where we are today. $14 billion of average annual loss. We estimated that $6.4 billion could be offset through insurance, but there's questions about the availability of that insurance and the cost. That changes, and the rest of it are things that are kind of on us to do. We've had conversations with 11 different communities now throughout the region, educating them on what the risks are, getting them thinking in a risk management frame of mind, taking a look at those low probability but high impact type events, seeing where we're vulnerable and identifying cost-effective things that we can do to take that risk off the table. We do it all the time with homeowners insurance, not because we believe our house is going to burn down, but because we just feel better making that investment. So we've had this conversation with our customers as well, and one of the things that really became obvious to us is that we can't do this all. We can't shield all this loss on our own. It takes partnerships with our customers. We realized fairly quickly that the water, the sewage treatment people that operated that have the same customer base as we do, and they depend upon our energy. So we asked them about, where do you feel vulnerable? What have you done? And how can we prioritize our investments in hardening our systems to be able to complement what you've done, reduce overall business interruption loss, and save the communities, our customer base, those losses. It's not just the asset losses. It's the lost productivity from the asset. Walmart loses its roof. There's lost sales. There's lost revenues. There's lost sales tax revenue. That ripples through the economy. And what we found was that there are additional investments that we can make in hardening our systems that have benefit to cost ratios in the neighborhood of 5 to 1. For every dollar investment, you get $5 of benefit when you take into account all these economic benefits for avoiding that business loss. So there are things we can do, and we're having that conversation, and we're looking to see if we can't preserve the viability of our region.
Great, thank you. Talking about insurance, we've got, I think, the perfect speaker to come next. Jay?
Thank you. Delighted to be here and to give you an overall perspective, a very high-level perspective about how the Hartford specifically and about how the property casualty insurance industry generally in the United States views the growing risk of severity and volatility in weather-related events. First, a little bit about the Hartford. The company is a 203-year-old company based in Hartford, Connecticut. We have about 20,000 employees. Last year's revenues were $26 billion. We insure over 1 million businesses, mostly small to medium-sized businesses, and then I think about 18 million individual customers as well. Next slide. First, a little bit about what insurance is, to remind what it is. And if you go to any insurance textbook, they'll basically say insurance is 3 things. It's a transfer system. So it gives the insured the chance to transfer the chance of financial loss to the insurance company. Second, it's a business. That means we as an insurance company, we conduct our operations in order to make sure that as the premiums come in, we invest them correctly and we price them correctly so that we have enough money to pay out claims when there are losses, and that there's some reasonable profit left over for that. And third, it's a legal contract between the insurance company and the insured. Okay, next slide. This is a courtesy of the Insurance Information Institute, which is a nonprofit information organization for the entire industry. This slide, I think, is kind of helpful to put in perspective how the insurance industry in the United States perceives catastrophic risk. Catastrophic risk is any single event that incurs a $25 million loss or greater. This pie chart shows the proportion of the last 20 years in the United States of of insured catastrophic losses and how they are apportioned, how they're distributed. It's important to think about insured because the overall cat losses over the last 20 years are higher than this, much higher than this. Generally, after a catastrophe, about half of the losses are insured losses, the other half or privately insured losses, the other half are not. So if you're an insurance company in the United States and think about your risks going forward, you also look backward. And looking backward, we see that 42% of all losses over the last 20 years were because of hurricanes and tropical storms. And then another 34% were tornadoes. So those two for an insurance company are the really big ones that we concern ourselves with, are very worried about. Beyond that, winter storms, a little over 7%. The next two catastrophic losses aren't in this discussion today because they have something to do outside of weather and climate change, and that is terrorism and geological events. Geological events being volcanoes, earthquakes, things like that. And then finally, wind, hail, flood for insurance companies, about 4% over the last 20 years. Keep in mind that obviously the flood losses were vastly higher than that, but in the United States, private insurers generally do not cover flood, especially on individual homes. That's covered by the federal government under the National Flood Insurance Program. So that's why that number, some insurers do offer some flood for businesses. Your car, for example, if it's in a flood, it's probably covered, but for houses, it's probably not. And then fires, we hear a lot about fires, and they are, of course, devastating. But in terms of insured loss, overall, plays a smaller role generally. Next slide. I wanted to talk about how the Hartford and it would be similar to other companies, how we look at enterprise risk management. So we exist really to manage risk, and we feel that we've been doing it pretty well because we've been doing it for 203 years. If you think about it, we paid out claims in the Great Chicago Fire, San Francisco earthquake, and Sandy and Katrina. So we insured Abraham Lincoln's home, and we insured Babe Ruth when he was playing baseball. So we have a long history of doing this. We have a very built-out enterprise risk management plan for all the kinds of risks that we face, including insurance risk, which is where severe weather events take place. So we try to make sure that the risk that we are taking on as a company is within our risk tolerances. And we have all kinds of processes internally to keep track of that. We can really almost do it on a daily basis, and it is reviewed up the chain of command in our company often to make sure that we stay within our tolerances. When we find that we're taking on more risk, or the nature of the risk has changed and we want to change as well, we always have the opportunity to lay off some of our risk to our insurance companies, which are reinsurers. We also obviously, as we take on more risk, we do it generally. You'll find insurance companies don't jump into an area and build out very quickly. We take our time and build out to make sure that we know kind of what we are getting into. We work with regulators, of course. We work with all of the cat modeling firms that you know about, so that they help us understand the catastrophe risk going forward, and we have a pretty robust dialogue with the science community, our own company specifically, and then in more general terms, we certainly try to understand the science, and that's really what drives us, because we're kind of insurance it's kind of just the facts, ma'am. It's not what might happen. We have to prove to our regulators that we are charging actuarially sound rates, which means that we have to show that we've suffered a certain amount of losses in order to be able to charge those rates. So we are very interested in getting the science, to understanding the science better, and to getting it to the place where for us it's more like actionable intelligence, where we know, where we have a more firm understanding in these geographies, these zip codes, what the risks are. So that's kind of, I should say also the Hartford, we have our own business resiliency efforts, which I'm sure we all do. We practice sometimes working, people practice working from home, and we have already a pretty large portion of our workforce that does work from home. And we found that that's actually been helpful because in the last few years, even in Hartford, Connecticut, we've had a couple of severe weather events that have really hampered people to get to work, and we found actually that so far anyway that practice has helped. Finally, we also as a company try very hard to do our own part on environmental stewardship. We have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions since 2007 through last year by 36.5%. We've reduced our paper usage a lot. We offer products for our customers, including premium discounts on electric vehicles. We have a standalone renewable energy insurance practice that offers insurance to the solar and wind and other renewable energy industries. And so we try to work hard as a company too to be good stewards of the environment.
Holistic approach, I like it. Sarah?
Great, thanks very much, and good morning. So I'm going to be talking, we've had a great selection of really very different businesses and different responses, some the same. We're a Weyerhaeuser company, who I work for, and I like to think of us as the original carbon capture and storage technology company. If I could have the next slide. We're a company that obviously our largest asset is our land and timber. We own or manage about 20 million acres of forest land across North America. In the United States, that's heavily concentrated in Oregon and Washington, and then across the southeastern states of the United States. So we have a lot of very positive impacts on atmospheric carbon through carbon sequestration of our timberlands, and then through product sequestration. We store carbon for the long term in products like 2x4s that go into making residential homes and schools and small commercial buildings, and that keeps that carbon stored for a period of time. We also have we've done an analysis of all of our emissions, which largely come from our manufacturing operations and our transportation system. In the next slide, that this integrated approach in the industry, we are becoming more unique to have really the whole value chain as part of our product line. We grow timber, we manufacture products from that timber, which are largely building materials and wood products, and then we use residuals for cellulose fibers, and then the residuals that can't go into a product go into providing the energy for our particular facilities, and our products and then go into things like residential homes. So we see that integrated approach also lending itself to a very balanced carbon cycle for the company. We, including the product sequestration, have a net positive impact in terms of sequestration. But focusing on resilience, if you could go to the next slide, we have, so if you look, sort of the initial focus we've had, if you look at our three main businesses, in timberlands, the big focus there is on research. I appreciated the discussion earlier this morning on the importance of science, and since we operate in the environment and frankly our trees don't grow well or they fall down if the climate or the weather is not cooperating. So it's a really important aspect for us to have been engaged in. We have scientists on staff that are studying fish and wildlife issues, aquatic biologists, habitat biologists, forest health and productivity. We have a fairly robust research program on ecosystem impacts, and we relate a lot of that back to what we're doing on the land. So if the different kinds of silviculture practices that we utilize, we are looking at them over. We're a 112-year-old company. We've been operating in the Pacific Northwest for over 100 years, so we have decades of research. We have paired watershed studies where we've looked at how we manage our lands against versus unmanaged lands and what is the difference in the watershed impacts. We've replicated that study in North Carolina, and then about 2 decades ago we moved into South America and we've replicated the same approach down there. So in timberlands, it's all about really understanding the ecosystem. We obviously care greatly that we understand what is happening with the climate and with the weather, because again, we make investments on a yearly basis for 25, 30, 40 years before we get any return. And that is a fairly significant risk period to be managed, where from a timberland standpoint, your risks are almost entirely climate related. On the manufacturing side, we have a fairly simple and obvious strategy, which is to become more energy self-sufficient and utilizing the resource that we have the greatest access to, which is biomass. So we currently provide across our wood products and cellulose fibers manufacturing 76% of our own energy supplies from the biomass that we have access to. That really helps when there are energy disruptions, when there are price spikes in the different fossil fuels. So it's a very strong business strategy as well as a climate strategy on the part of the company. If I could go to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit, since we've been very focused on weather, and again, a lot of what we do ultimately always comes back to weather. We do invest a lot in, when we talk about forest health, that is really evaluating what are the kind of silvicultural techniques we can use to promote forest health. So we as a company invest a lot in thinning our stands. That allows the the trees that remain to have greater access to nutrients, water, sunlight. That also happens to be a really great strategy to combat the problems that we see a lot in the West, in unhealthy forests, largely on public lands, where you see insects, diseases, and frankly, climate impacts having a more devastating effect because the forest itself is not terribly resilient. So we have a strong interest in making our stands as resilient as possible, and the silvicultural techniques we use are are focused on that. It's been interesting. I'll talk about this when we get to the last little circle there, but one of the things we have found is as climate changes, the impacts that we've been used to, we're seeing a difference in, not just in the greater extremes, but in just behaving differently. We also use like farmers have for centuries, we use genetic selection and have invested a lot in that area. So what we started doing really 4 or 5 decades ago was looking for superior seed sources in the natural environment. So in the Douglas fir forest of the Northwest, we would look for which trees grew taller, straighter, stronger, and we would use those seeds, take them back to a nursery, reproduce those, and that's what we plant when we go in and harvest. It turns out, as we didn't start this with that intention, we were really looking for straighter, stronger trees. But it turns out that's a very great strategy for climate impacts, because when you have an insect or disease infestation and you have a less robust diversity in the genetics of a tree, you can wipe out a watershed that may be really just one. If you look across the Northwest, it's mostly a Douglas fir forest. In a particular watershed, they're all going to be related to one another. When we've brought up seedlings from Oregon and planted them in Washington, that actually has enhanced the genetic diversity, and those forests are more robust in terms of dealing with different climate conditions. In the Southeast, we've been experiencing drought as well as floods, but 2 or 3 years ago in our holdings in Arkansas and Oklahoma, we had 100% mortality of seedlings. So we're now using our genetic selection program to look for genetic trees that have the genetic characteristic of tolerating drought better, because we anticipate over the next 30, 40 years, where we are growing seedlings that we're planting now are going to experience periods of drought and are going to need to have sort of greater resources at hand. We have done, as I talked about, ecosystem research in both watersheds, and that's really looking at water quality as well, but more particularly water quantity. So I'll talk about the research we've done in Uruguay. We afforested a part of Uruguay that had previously been used for centuries as grazing land. And as the government, working with the company as well as universities in both Uruguay as well as the United States, really wanted to know the answer to the question of, if we plant trees, what's that going to do to the water table? Is it going to help it? Is it going to hurt it? And it's it's really a complex relationship. You can look at it and say, oh, those trees are going to use all the water. But the fact that you have trees means they're able to pull water out of the atmosphere. So we've got now 2 decades worth of data, lots of people interested in looking at that and also trying to correlate it to climate changes that that we are starting to pay more attention to. In the last slide on landslide assessments, like anybody operating in the Northwest, we have done thoroughly mapped all of our lands, which are, can operate on slopes as steep as 70, 80%. And when you're planting or harvesting, we're very mindful. We do not want to see landslides. We do not want to lose soil, because soil is our factory. And so we have used what was industry standards on 100-year floods and 100-year storms to make sure we were logging in a way that it would reduce the chance, or putting in forest roads, ultimately to reduce the chance that you could experience landslides. In December of 2007, we had the 500-year flooding event that was both extreme. I think the one of the micro areas hardest hit got 18 or 20 inches of water over a 24-hour period. I mean, it's just an enormous amount of water. But when I talked about weather's behaving differently, so over 100 years of operating in the Pacific Northwest, and of all of the records that the University of Washington has about weather events, you either had high wind events or you have heavy flooding events. We have never had a storm that had both, but this storm had both. So it was not just extreme, it was different. It was a different pattern. Our response to that we launched our researchers out there working with University of Washington and other government scientists in the state to look at how do we better assess the possibility or the potential for landslides. So when the next 500-year event comes, and we're betting it's going to be sooner than 500 years from now, that we will have managed those lands in a way to reduce the possibility of landslides. And then lastly, I wanted to, if I could have the next slide, talk about, this is all of that work, I would say, is sort of defensive work. We are all about protecting our asset and ensuring that we can operate our business based on being able to grow and harvest the trees on the timeline and the schedule that is optimum for our business purposes and the product purposes. But we're also looking at business opportunities that would address issues associated with a changing climate or with reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And they range from things like arborite, which is a fertilizer that we have developed that is a low nitrogen releasing fertilizer. So that we've put out for sale on the market. So that has both water quality benefits as well as air greenhouse gas benefits. One of my favorite ones is what's called Weyerhaeuser Edge Gold. This is a flooring product that you put out in, when you're building a house, you put up the 2x4s, then you put the floors in. All of that happens before you get a roof to protect it from the climate. And one of the big problems is if you have an unusually stormy period, a lot of times you can't get back in. You've put the floor down and then it starts to rain, and the floor absorbs all that water and it warps, and it's problematic. You develop waste, you slow down production, and so we developed a technology. It sounds sort of obvious and a little bit simple, but it basically is to put some holes in a little ridge along this flooring product so that the water can drain off. And we have found a great response to that in this East Coast marketplace where that is a real problem for builders building, that waiting for the floors to dry out again. Our floors dry in a much faster period of time after a major storm event. We've been working with partners on both wind energy on some of our western timberlands. We have a joint venture with Catchlight, with Chevron. It's called Catchlight Energy, and that's looking to make liquid transportation fuels out of biofuels, and we're looking at feedstocks that we might be able to supply to that, and they're obviously looking for biofuels that they can feed into their system. So we're looking at, in terms of business resilience, I wanted to not have it all be defensive. I wanted to talk about there's some opportunity out there to adapt and also find solutions that people will be interested in to address, and that there's opportunity in those solutions. So
I think that's a great way to end. I have a few questions, but I also want to make sure that we have time to get questions from the audience. So let me ask at least one, and then I'll turn it over to you folks. we've been talking about business drivers. I know you've all experienced extreme weather events and costs. How are you prioritizing your efforts? How are you assessing the materiality of these impacts when you look you look out into the future? Maybe, does anybody want to take a quick shot at that? I know Jeff and Sarah probably have something to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, after each one of these storms, we sit down and figure out what went well and what could be done better, and we prioritize that way. But what we're seeing are really new normals. I mean, if you depend upon the past to try to project where the future is, we're seeing things that are different. So that's why we use this Gulf Coast adaptation study to be able to take a look at scenarios of the future that were guided by the science and be able to help come up with new scenarios and see where we're vulnerable. The second thing we're doing is, as I mentioned, is sitting down with our customers and figuring out what we can do to complement and really kind of prioritizing based upon reducing business interruption loss. We could sit down and draw a line along I-10 Louisiana and harden everything in there, but that doesn't mean that the customers are going to be able to take the load. So if we can prioritize those investments based upon what's important to them and along this idea of preserving the economic viability of our customer base, that's the way we're thinking.
Janet, I would respond, and I think probably not too differently for most companies, is our first priority is the defensive priority. It is protecting our asset, and it is ensuring that we can deliver. We supply businesses for the most part. We are not, except for the home building business, which we sell directly to retail, we're a B2B supplier. And what they want to make sure is that their supply is not disrupted. And so we are very focused. Our priorities are in ensuring that in our timberlands that the highest priorities are, when we get into situations of drought and flooding, it's pretty easy to justify spending money there on either research or on mitigation measures that you need to take to respond to that. At our facilities, it is going to be ensuring, we have facilities that are in earthquake zones, are in flood zones, and that we've protected those particular operations so that they can continue to operate and customers can be supplied. There is the business opportunity side, and sometimes that's that's an important development. It's important to put some R&D effort into that. It may be a little bit easier, like when times get tough, to say, well, let's not invest in that because we don't know what the return is going to be on that. But you work on what you go through a typical ROI process, and you try to work on what you think is going to be give you the greatest return. I wanted to just touch on the materiality question because and just to make the point that, because I know there's a lot of focus on people wanting to make sure companies are doing more reporting on materiality and what does climate change mean, what does weather mean, and you can look at our 10Qs and 10Ks and you'll find lots of descriptions about what we're doing on insects and disease and tornadoes and when we've had those problems. But speculating out into the future, what it's actually going to cost us, is really hard. I mean, you would not have in 2006 written anything about a 500-year storm event causing landslides in Washington, because it had never happened in 112 years. So it's really hard. Then suddenly you have it. So that changes now how you look at it, and you incorporate that knowledge. But it's, I think, trying to find both real certainty around what will be the quantitative impact of a particular event, but even more so when that event is going to occur, is, I think, a real challenge for business. And I think we need to be really careful sometimes. The push to make sure we can quantify that may be giving information. I think we need to talk about qualitatively what the risks are, absolutely, but I do think the quantitative push right now on SEC disclosure, it can give investors, in a way, really misleading information.
This issue of uncertainty and even government provision of science. I mean, the earlier panel discussed this, and I mean, I think that's an important role, and we highlight that in our report. Maybe maybe Jeff and Jay, before I open it up, maybe you guys could talk about the role of government outside of the Senate, because we know that that's an important role that they play.
Well, I think government, I guess, actions in this area could be guided by a typical lens of what you think about of the role of government and what are the things that can be best provided privately versus collectively. Certainly, the government has had a very major role in transportation, and I think that one of the ways that we've talked about climate impacts on businesses, it's been through transportation. It's not just businesses, but the whole communities that surround in there. So that's kind of one lens. Is it a public good or a private good? Transportation's public good. There are lots of public goods. So I think there's a call for any public good to have government-private interaction on this. Just as a general lens, and in the same way that net present value analysis is good for looking at climate resiliency, as long as you're including that information about climate in there, it's perfectly good. Same way our typical lens for government interaction and these sorts of things is the old lens is going to be very useful.
From an insurance company perspective, first we look at the role of government as regulator, and we're regulated by each of the 50 states, so we care a lot about what the regulators, how they're thinking and what they're saying. And one easy one there, state and local level, is to build building standards so that and enforce them. And once you have them, we really find, I think, generally that when you have stronger building standards in areas that are prone to, say, wind, that the losses are demonstrably lower. So there's one. Also, the government plays a very good role as to build awareness and to prompt. And I'm thinking there, the Hartford has just joined something that the US EPA started not too long ago called, I think it's the Workplace Electric Vehicle Charging Station Challenge. And so they are encouraging large employers in the United States to put EV charging stations in their own facilities to help their employees who commute to have another solution other than internal combustion engines, and we're delighted to be part of that. So that's kind of one way. And obviously, when it comes to the science, we are very interested in kind of gathering all the best science and seeing how well we can use that in our as we think about how the risks, and especially severe and changing weather-related risks, are going to affect our book of business.
Jan, if I could just add one thing, which is I think whenever we talk about government roles, and a lot of times the focus is what can government do to help propel good, either the behavior that's going to be beneficial or thoughtful about climate and extreme weather and resilience. But there's another, government has many roles, and government can tend to be compartmentalized. So there are things that government can do that are discouraging. And I would just say one issue that I know we have to deal with is, I talked about silviculture, and we make investments on a yearly basis where we don't get a return until we harvest the tree, say 30 years later. So, right now, because of deficit reduction, the taxing authorities are looking at, right now we are allowed to expense those silvicultural expenses, which makes more sense from a financial management standpoint, and it encourages silviculture. They're looking at capitalizing those expenses, so you wouldn't be able to take any tax benefit basically from your investments until you actually get to that 30-year point, which is going to really discourage silvicultural activities that are factly, very helpful from a climate change standpoint. So I don't think the taxing people think about climate change necessarily, but they need to. And I think that's one of the things I would recommend is, as government, both the executive branch and the legislative branches, is focusing on these issues, you need to take sort of that broader perspective.
Unintended consequences,
Right.
for sure. Jeff?
I wanted to put a pitch in for the science agencies. NOAA, USGS, NASA. They provide vital information that's really important to all of us. They get engaged. There's down on the Gulf Coast. There's it's called the Community of Practice. But all of these organizations work with the communities, Sea Grant and whatnot, to plan for, anticipate, and inject really good input into this. I recall when I first moved down to Houston. I'm originally from upstate New York. And going away present was this book, Isaac Storm. And it was about the 1900 hurricane down in Galveston.
That was your going away present?
Yeah. It changed my mind. I was going to buy waterfront property down there. I built in Kingwood. So. Any event, the story goes about Isaac, who's a weatherman down there, walking the beach in the morning and noticing something was wrong. Tried to get people to pay attention, and that storm came ashore later that day. 8,000 people died. And the thing that caught my attention is there's a monument that's built down on Galveston to the people that died in that storm. And Hurricane Ike, when it came through, had 12-foot storm surge. This 1900 hurricane had 12-foot storm surge. And because of things they did with painful hindsight, there was only 125 people that died as a result of Ike. But a big part of that is the ability for us to see a storm coming, give ourselves a week or so of time to plan. Sandy was coming in, and you could see it moving up the coast. And you have an opportunity to react, to get, from a utility perspective, get resources in place. Last year we had Isaac, and we had 10,000 skilled workers waiting to come in for the storm to clear and for it to safe to come in. You're able to use that mutual aid system. There's a whole bunch of things that happen because of this information that we're getting. And the last thing about it is there's a huge data set out there that we aren't making use of. If we could downscale that information on a regional level to help us identify what the risks might be into the future, that's going to be really, really valuable. I think it's going to be done with the National Climatic Data Center, and they got all tangled up, but
Well, they're working on it.
I hope so.
So let's take a few questions from the audience. Kai, I saw your hand go right up.
Hi, Kai Jensen with Bank of America, and just picking up on this theme of kind of the role of government, turning the table a little bit, it seems to me that experiences from the private sector, like with Weyerhaeuser as a specific example, there are a lot of actions that your company has taken and a lot of learnings that have taken place. And I'm wondering, and maybe there's no immediate answer to this, but I'm just wondering how information can actually flow back to the government. So rather than looking to government agencies for answers, it seems like there's a lot of knowledge already out there. And in particular in the President's Climate Action Plan, and thinking specifically in the example of the timber industry, there was a lot of discussion around resiliency and mitigation. I think that was a really important and new and refreshing part of the delivery of that plan. I know Eileen alluded to that earlier. And interestingly, the President spoke specifically about timberland and forests and the need to protect these resources. So I'm kind of curious, it sounds like, Sarah, from your presentation, that you've had good interaction at the state level and there's been a good exchange of knowledge. I'm just wondering, has there been any indication of exchange of that knowledge back to the federal level in managing timber resources? And again, it seems really clear to me that Weyerhaeuser has had some really great learnings, has been able to manage its resource to help consider the need to be resilient and adaptive to climate change. And I'm wondering, especially since it was a part of the President's discussion, he made reference to the timber sector, if you might comment on that related to that.
Sir, can we take another question and then
Sure.
combine two questions? Okay, I saw a question in the back there.
Thank you. Mark Gunther from Guardian Sustainable Business. Given the risks,
Here's the mic there.
given the risks that you've all talked about this morning, I know Rio Tinto and Entergy have both been voices here in Washington for climate regulation. As best as I could tell, neither Weyerhaeuser nor the Hartford have taken a position in terms of any kind of meaningful climate regulation. Why not?
Well, actually, I just respond. Weyerhaeuser is a part of US CAP, and so we actually have a pretty strong position supporting a nationwide program for regulating carbon. And we wanted to see it be uniform across the states because we operate in so many different states. We've been a part of the Washington State. I was on the governor's panel for the climate action team, and in 2006 we made our first greenhouse gas emission reduction of a 40% reduction by 2020 based on a 2000. So I actually think we've taken a pretty strong stand on climate.
Sorry, I looked at your website. It wasn't on there. I forgot about you.
I'm glad you brought that up. So I was like, oh.
The Hartford, as I mentioned, since we are regulated by states, that's where most of our efforts are. We're looking, obviously, overall to have to continue to have a price signals, because we think if insurance is priced to match the risk, then a lot of good things flow from that. We also, we put out a climate change statement on our external website in 2007. We are involved in a number of ways that I described about how our own company tries to reduce our footprint. We also try to help our customers also prepare them for risks coming. But we don't have a really strong, robust discussion in Washington. That's true.
Sarah, let's go back and answer Kai's question too.
I just want to, and just really briefly, we view that in the cases where we're doing the ecosystem research, that actually the benefit of that is if that becomes public knowledge. And so most of that research is done in conjunction with federal agencies. Now that will tend to be with the Forest Service or the Department of Agriculture. It's also done in cooperation with, there's an industry research organization called the National Council on Air and Stream Improvement. And the goal of all of that research is to make it public. So when we've done these paired watershed studies, those are done in conjunction with North Carolina State University and Oregon State University. And we actually have a specific directive to say if the research is being done, it has to be made public so that people know it. Some of the genetic research, that is more proprietary, and because that's going directly to the product that we're building, so that is not shared as much. But the ecosystem information is actually, we think for exactly the point that I think you were inferring, is that that's important information to get out, in that we work very closely with all of those agencies because it's a body of science that has to develop, and you leverage other people's work. So we would agree that that needs to happen, and that's how we work that program.
The pickup is good, or is it early?
The pickup is good, but like any, say the landslide research we did got a lot of people's interest in. We went out and did a landslide assessment and figured out a different model for being able to utilize that, but we did that in conjunction with the universities, the state. I don't recall whether or not the federal government was involved. I could check on that, but it is the people who are working on those issues. I do think there's a very good pickup and a good relationship, and again, it also gets shared more broadly within the industry through the NACASI organization.
I think we have time. I'm sorry about this, but we probably only have time for one more question. If you would go ahead, that'd be great.
Thank you. Again, Jennifer Kiefer with the Alliance for Industrial Efficiency. And my question is actually a parroting of the question I'd asked on the previous panel. As a quick recap, our focus is on finding ways to advance deployment of combined heat and power distributed generation. And at the time I'd spoken with, I think, Tom of National Grid about how CHP can both reduce the incidence of climate change in the first place and then also allow for resilience of the industries that are using it because they're able to function independent of the grid. Tom's response was kind of regionally specific to the National Grid territory, saying that the regulatory pieces are really in place in that region and sympathetic or supportive of CHP. My question now for Jeff with Entergy is what kind of regulatory changes do you think need to be put in place throughout your operations area to increase the use of CHP or other forms of distributed energy?
Well, one of the challenges is to find the right host partner for that. And we invested $300 million in a CHP plant in Lake Charles. We take half the power from that. And also, that provides steam and electricity for others. It's called RS Cogen. Where those opportunities exist, we try to act on it. But the challenge is always to find the areas where there's a good steam host, a good electric host, where that all fits. We think that it's absolutely critical to get more efficiency into our system. I mean, we've invested $3.2 billion over the last 10 years, nearly 4,000 megawatts of combined cycle gas turbine capacity, which is much more energy efficient than our old steam. It allows us to reduce that steam, use less fuel, and reduce our footprint, water footprint. We also have invested in upgrades to nuclear plants, 700 megawatts, which gives us non-emitting generation. So overall, we're working to increase efficiency and reduce our CO2 intensity, and we've got ourselves in a pretty good position. But it's really important to think strategically across the board about how you can be competitive in a carbon-constrained economy given the markets that you have. And I think the biggest opportunity for us is in petrochemical refining areas. But it's difficult to do uniformly throughout our whole franchise territory.
There's a saying that it's good to leave folks wanting more. And unfortunately, we don't have any more time for more questions. But the good news is that we have our case study companies, folks here have agreed to do a series of webinars to dive deeper on their particular case studies and in particular what they're doing to make their businesses more resilient to climate change. So starting in September, we'll have a series of webinars. I invite you to check out our website, get on our mailing list, to find out when those webinars are, because there is much more of the story to hear. Unfortunately, we just don't have time to share it at this point. I think we've had a very good day, a full morning, really looking at what are the key issues with respect to building resilience to climate change and extreme weather. But I think there is significantly more that can be done in this area. There's definitely a role for companies, there's a role for governments. We have a few recommendations, we have many recommendations actually in our report, talking about the role for companies, the role for governments. There's risks that companies can manage themselves, and then there are risks outside their fence line that requires government and other involvement. We're very happy to be able to work with these companies to actually learn from them what they need. We think one of the most important things needed is to be able to get better information. Companies need credible, scientific-based information to be able to deal with this and assess the risks. And while we know that companies are stepping into this space, we also know they don't have the tools to be able to do it very effectively. Fortunately, some leading companies have actually been able to develop their own tools and go out and try to figure this out. But there's a lot of room here for improvement. So I invite you to read our report. We've got a lot more information in that. At this point, I'd like to thank a couple people. I'd like to thank our report authors, Meg Crawford, hiding in the back, and Steve Seidel, who was over here somewhere. There he is behind. So we're very happy with their work on this area. Also, I need to thank Michael Tubman, who's helped put this event together, and also the Bank of America for supporting us in this research. And thanks to you all for joining us this morning. I wish you a good day. Take care now.